Questions before we start putting these down. Which of these were reasonably easy to do, and which of them were difficult? Which between these, which were the easiest to tackle?
The beginning ones.
Which beginning ones?
A and B.
A and B are okay. Yeah.
I feel like this entire exercise was drawing lines in the sand that is up to our neck.
Oh yeah?
Because all of them influence one another in specific and nuanced ways.
Right.
So it's like, well, we're talking about emotions, and we're bordering on behavior and cognition, and now we're talking about development, and that is really dependent upon like everything happening.
Right.
And behaviors depend on everything happening, and they're all like this, but needed like this. It's just gross.
Gross? That's an interesting word to use. So pulling them apart was harder than you expected. Okay. So affect, behavior was kind of okay. What about the other ones? What made the other ones so hard? Yes.
Cognition to a point seemed to repeat some of the stuff in affect.
Okay.
And that was difficult to like find stuff to differentiate.
Yes. I mean, the challenge of that is talking about a pure feeling, that's it. And it really is the challenge of assessment when we're talking about these things, because affect generally drags us over into cognition. And that's the challenge, okay? And whatever of these you found yourself wrestling with or struggling with the most, that's the one you probably should concentrate the most on in your project. Because those are the ones that we find it hard to come up with questions. We find it hard to kind of separate them apart, because it's true. They're all interrelated, clearly, particularly in the developmental sense, and even in the ecological sense they are. But if we're going to try to figure out, because the intervention is all about kind of a strategy for it, okay? And the thing I want to just differentiate for you before we kind of put these up is there's a difference between tactics and strategy. And it's important to understand that when we're talking about crisis intervention. Tactics is really more on the counseling level. So wherever I'm going to address specific issues is a tactic. Strategy has more to do with why am I doing that tactic and what am I trying to accomplish? Okay? So tactics are the specific techniques I use to address a particular area, but strategy is it's got to take me somewhere. Okay? If you think of it in a military sense, what soldiers do at the front lines is tactics. What generals decide as to how to take the battlefield is strategy. And when we're talking about crisis intervention, we can't just fly by the seat of our pants and just hope that it works. We've got to be able to separate these things out to have a clear enough understanding that there is one area that if I intervene effectively in, it will probably spread to all the other areas. But if I just kind of say, yeah, I learned this model many years ago and it starts with A, let's just start with affect. Well, that may not necessarily be the person's need. And that's the key to try to understand this. Splitting them apart is only temporary. It really is only temporary because we're talking about a whole person, right? I mean, we're talking about whatever the person is experiencing comes all together. And that's why you struggle with, like Gabe said, if you go to affect, you're all automatically kind of drifting toward cognition. But there are specific things here in terms of what the person thinks that I might have a huge impact on. If I can address this, maybe I can impact the affect. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So when you asked that question earlier, which one was easiest? I thought the cognition was the easiest because it's like that's. I think personally, maybe it's easier for me.
Yeah.
Like that's what I think about. Like before something happened, how do you deal with that, and like what do you believe about yourself in dealing with these situations and all that stuff? And I feel like that would help me get to the affect more because that was harder. Because I don't know, like if I'm feeling shocked, but I don't know, like can't say words about like which specific feelings I'm feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, and even in shock, you may not have the words to convey it either. So, I mean, cognition may not be all that helpful either. Because in a lot of cases, when somebody's in a crisis, one of these oftentimes shuts down altogether. They just quit thinking, for example, or shock, they just quit feeling. And that's all part of that we have to keep in mind. So the challenge, and I've been kind of compiling some resources because I've had a few people ask me about it, about what's some examples of things that you could read or do for your project. And one that I just thought of, I was driving in this morning, I thought of it, is a case profile of a guy by the name of Louis Zamperini. Anybody know that? He was profiled in the book Unbroken. And that book is done so well that you've got all the material you need right in that book about Louis Zamperini. Angelina Jolie started her directorial debut with the movie of Unbroken in it. And it's a remarkable story. She didn't kind of highlight what happened at the end because he came back pretty unbroken but broken. But that's a good example. There are other ones if you're into and interested in some military ones. There's one guy during World War II that was in the Pacific with the Marines. He wrote a book, My Helmet for a Pillow. Bob Leckie is his name, and he was with the Marines in the South Pacific, and he was a journalist, which made the writing even better. And that's just another example. There's a lot of biographies out there of people that you can use and pull together all the things you need for a profile like we're talking about here. And those are just a couple examples. I'll have a bigger list for you as I think more about it, but those are a couple. All right, now let's talk about affect. What negative effects, all right? What negative things do you see or did you come up with, or negative examples as to how somebody's affect would be impacted by a crisis? And just yell them out, and I'll just write them down, and we'll have a list of any of them. What?
Affect can be super overwhelming at first, but
okay.
That's a negative effect because sometimes it's too much to handle.
Yeah.
But sometimes shutting down can be helpful in just putting the emotions to the side so you can function.
Yeah.
And then dealing with them later.
So
both positive and negative. It just depends on how you deal with it.
So shutting down is part of that. Mm-hmm. And yes, it could be both. I mean, initially, the interesting thing about that particular one with affect is that the person becomes unresponsive in the situation they're in. And even if they're harmed, they oftentimes don't have the feeling to kind of prompt them into action. So the shutdown part, in the emphasis on the negative part, it certainly would be. You could say that's a buffering thing, which would be a strength. You could put it in both places because it's a buffering. It buffers a person from the horrific nature of whatever it is they're going through. What else? Other things you came up with?
Guilt.
Guilt? Okay. Anxiety. Okay.
Fear.
Okay.
Anger.
Okay. Insecurity. What else? Isolation. Is that a behavior or feeling?
Well, it can be a feeling.
Okay, so feeling isolated,
Yeah.
or being isolated, or isolating.
You can be with a bunch of people and still feel isolated.
Yes, no doubt. Yeah. And you could put that up there too, because a lot of times what people do when they're in a crisis is they hunker down and get away from people or draw into themselves. What else? Any other feelings? Yeah.
Numbness and confusion.
Yeah, numbness. Confusion. Anything else?
Hopelessness.
Hopelessness. Okay. Anything else?
I mean, like Doug said, trust is kind of pretty shattered.
Yeah. Distrust. I don't know. That probably would come over here. The question would be, what's the feeling of distrust? I mean, how would we convey that? Is it paranoid? Yeah. Suspicious?
Betrayed.
Okay. Okay. Now, what about strengths? What kinds of things did you come up there? What things do we see in the person from an affective point of view that would be a strength to build on to be able to recover from the crisis that occurred? Cautiousness. Okay. I'm not going to go into that thing again. Yep. Yeah.
Stubbornness can be a strength when it leads to rebellion.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it ends up actually looking like stubbornness when in fact it's a factor of allowing the person to bounce back from it. Anything else?
Empathy.
Empathy. Might be a little early. In some cases, you might see somebody trying to take care of everybody else, which would interfere with their recovery, but at the same time, it would be a skill that they could do. Reestablish some sense of control. What else? The interesting thing that you guys haven't said is that oftentimes the expression of these emotions is an indication of strength. Okay? There's a certain level of freedom. We see it as somebody being, and this is what's so upside down, particularly when we're talking about this subject, okay? Is we see somebody that is really acting out. They're having all of this expression of all of these emotions and everything else. And what do we say internally is, they're out of control. And I would suggest to you that maybe it isn't that they're out of control at all. They have enough freedom just to express it the way it is, which really sets them up to recover more quickly. The people that are shutting down are definitely in danger. If there's no smoke and there's nothing coming out, that's when you should be worried. Not when somebody is going, kind of going quote unquote ballistic. I mean, all of our descriptors of people in crisis oftentimes are tinged with shame. Like they're falling apart, or they're losing it, or they're losing control. And that may not necessarily be the case. In some respects, it might actually be indicative of a strength the person has to be able to be free enough to express these things, because it lets them get some equilibrium back. Okay? And that's an easy thing to see, because why? We get uncomfortable with their feelings. And when that happens, I'm not going to frame it in a way to say, well, good. I'm glad they're saying all this stuff. Sometimes the helpers are the people that are the targets. And people that are able to have a decent set of boundaries around that say, give it your best shot. It's one way to get all this stuff out. I'll take it. And that there's a healthiness about that sometimes you don't see, because we carry all of this self-evaluative crap with us when we start getting blown away by whatever it is. And then it goes on top and says, Don't look out of control. Don't lose it. Don't go through any of that. Because other people will think that you're just, you're crazy. And all of those self-evaluative things interfere with some level of resilience that comes out of just expressing emotions straight up. Okay? Okay. The other quote-unquote easy one. What about behaviors? What'd you see? What'd you come up with?
Doing drugs.
Say that again?
Doing drugs.
Doing drugs, yeah. Okay. Drug abuse.
Self-harm.
Self-harm.
Over under eating.
Pardon me?
Over under eating.
Okay. Over under eating. Okay.
Isolation versus like presence.
Okay. Isolation. You said versus. Okay. We'll leave it there. What else? Controlling. Okay.
Violence.
Okay. In usual nomenclature, particularly adolescents, we just call it acting out, which is fitting, because a lot of times the stuff that's going on in here, I push out toward other people. What else?
Extreme reactions or reflexes.
Okay. What would be an example of extreme reaction?
So I mean, like flinching very at any like sudden movement or big sounds, that sort of thing.
Okay. Startle. Reflex. Okay. What else?
Apathy.
Apathy.
Maybe like suicidality.
Yep. The opposite of that? Homicidality. We've got to take both into account. Okay. What else? Any other behaviors we don't have up here?
Fight, flight, or freeze at inappropriate times.
Yeah. I'm not going to write them all out. Fight, flight, or freeze. The 3 Fs. Yeah, absolutely. Even when the person is not in danger. Okay. Anything else? I mean, in terms of just your responses, look at how full this one is and how long it took us to get to full over here. The behaviors are a lot easier to find and see. A lot of times, wherever I go, particularly like I said with behaviors, this is typical, okay? We start here and we go this way and this way. Okay, we identify what the behavior is, and then we can say, well, what kind of emotional impact, influence is there? And with this behavior, what kind of thought process goes with it? Okay, what about strengths in this one with behaviors?
Like allowing presence.
Allowing what?
Allowing presence.
Allowing
people to be around.
Yeah. I'll put it anyway. Might be traumatic for people to see. What else?
Healthy, like coping habits.
Coping habits.
Stuff like that.
Yeah. Let's see. Igniting coping habits. Yeah, they use the stress to actually ignite the old coping mechanisms that they've had before. Anything else? What else?
Counseling.
Counseling, absolutely. Of course, it could really be in terms of their response to counseling, would tell us something about where they are in terms of help later on. What else? Other strengths that we see behaviorally. Yeah.
Expressing themselves verbally and or otherwise.
Yeah.
Art, through writing.
Yep. Expressions. We might, in terms of what you just said, Hannah, you could say multimodal. What that means is writing verbally Art. Okay, sometimes people just find other ways to draw it out. All of those are multimodal expressions. What else? Anything else? Yeah.
Just asking for help.
Yeah, absolutely. Asking for help. Okay.
Self-control.
Self-control. The danger of that one is self-control can potentially turn into over-control, which then kind of comes up here and kind of all of this suppression that comes along. So yeah, it's kind of a balanced self-control that the person engages in that gives us a hint of what we can build off of. Anything else?
Maybe you could just say, like, I don't know how to say this distinctly, but like commending someone's reflex behaviors and like positioning behaviors in rooms and things like that as like you were protecting yourself, or like a part in the idea was protecting you, and that's good, but let's learn about why we don't need it anymore.
Yeah, and that would really, it kind of falls into vigilance behavior. Vigilance behavior isn't always bad. And at times when we see people that are engaging in these things, we're very quickly to label it as this becomes dangerous. Well, it is dangerous when it turns into hypervigilance, but being mindful of your environment and being mindful of the things that are kind of environmental awareness is one of the words that oftentimes is used, is not a bad thing at all. Okay, what about cognition? Thought process. How does a crisis negatively affect thought process? Yeah.
Like learned helplessness?
Yes. Helplessness. Okay. What else?
Blame.
Pardon me?
Self-blame.
Self-blame.
Matsakis, is that how you say that name?
Yeah, Matsakis.
Yeah, that one. In the book, she talks about how there are like 3 assumptions that people have about like themselves in the world, and some of those just being totally blown out of the water.
Yeah. She's borrowing it from something that Aaron Beck put together called the cognitive triad. And this is the belief around myself, about how the world works, and about other people. And usually, all 3 of those of that cognitive triad are affected by a crisis. Like, I'm helpless, people are dangerous, and God has abandoned me. That would be a world view. Okay. Yeah. What else?
Obsession and spiraling.
Yeah. And you might put in obsession and compulsions, which would also go along with that. And then I'll change it, Kaylin, to escalating instead of spiraling. It usually escalates in terms of obsessiveness or compulsiveness. That also you have to keep into account what is the pre-crisis kind of personality for the person. Because if they're already a little compulsive or obsessive about things, it goes into overdrive during a crisis. What else? Other cognition things.
Thinking in terms of all or nothing.
Yeah, all or nothing. Okay, good. What else? Paranoia. We go back to that suspiciousness. Now, that goes from a feeling, over here, we had this up here somewhere, right there, from a feeling to a assumption about no one is safe. And again, it's kind of the same idea. Cognition supports affect. Anything else?
Defense mechanisms?
Yeah. Now, when we talk about defense mechanisms, we're not talking about them in the Freudian sense, but denial and suppression and minimizing and justification are not trying to kind of keep the battle between the superego and id in check. They really are kind of strategies cognitively to try to manage the overwhelming nature of what's going on. What about strengths that we see in terms of how people think that in the crisis or after it?
Caution.
Caution. Okay.
Labeling emotions.
Yeah. Accurately, of course. Labeling emotions. On that point, okay, and I don't know if any of you landed here or not, but the ability to analyze the situation, think it through, okay? There are places for people to be able to look at a situation and analyze it in terms of its impact on people and themselves and kind of logic their way through. People that tend to be more intellectualizers, okay, tend to bring that into the situation, and it's not bad. Now, when they stay there and that's the only thing they do, it becomes bad. But it is a strength that can be utilized if they're able to analyze the situation. Yeah, any more?
Maybe like an increased understanding of suffering,
Yeah, I mean, what we might see is what we might just chalk up to as an introspection, a willingness to self-reflect. Now, again, a lot of these things exist prior to the crisis, generally. So they're bringing it in, and that's not a bad thing at all. It helps them to be able to cope with the situation, to look at. Now, self-reflection and introspection can, it's a double-edged sword, because it can take us back into insecurity, what I could have done, should have done, all that kind of stuff. So we have to be mindful of that, but that is a possibility. Anything else? Yeah.
I think kind of just bouncing off of analyzing and introspection, maybe you could talk about like boundaries in the sense of ownership of what's mine and not mine.
Yep. Yeah, and reestablishing boundaries, but it also would be a understanding of boundaries as well. And again, it's one of those reasons. It's one of the reasons why I talk about boundaries as much as I do, because I can tell you from people that have been through crisis, the resilient people are clear about what they're responsible for and what they're not. And that's where boundaries come in. Okay, what about development? What did you think of in terms of the negative impact crisis has on development?
Regression.
Yep, regression. And that's not just a kid thing, okay? An adult that becomes helpless and kind of curls up in a ball and somebody has to help them kind of get out of that place is regressing, okay? It's not just a kid thing. What else?
The should haves.
Yeah. Now, the question in development is, where does that lead the person? Okay? There are lots of paths. When we talk about development and crisis, there are lots of paths that keep leading back to regressiveness. So I should have, then it takes us into cognition, and it takes us into affect, but the reflection back on what goes on and an expectation of something they should have known this is really one good example of how complicated kind of disentangling development is, because it's written into all of us. It's written into all of us. We're not even all that aware of how our development has impacted until it starts showing up in the crisis mode. Okay? Anything else?
Inability to maintain a relationship.
Yeah. Keep relationships. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Like uneven development,
Mm-hmm.
or like an enhanced, physical or cognitive development, but still in a childlike emotional development.
Yep. And that rarely, you might put the word stunted in here or fixated, is that oftentimes, rarely does a person race ahead, but they do get stuck. You know, I mentioned that in other cases. Anything else? The other thing I'd mention here with kids is kids can appear more mature than they are in crisis situations because it's been modeled for them. And that's not always a good thing. Okay? Now, adults say, and oftentimes encourage kids to kind of hold it together. And that's, again, it's one of these instances where it's kind of a mixed bag. Because kids need to be kids even in a crisis. And adults need to be adults. Now, that's not an imperative, but at the same time, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, protective behavior, it wouldn't be in this, it would be down here. Okay? The adults that are being protective of younger kids in a crisis they're letting them do their thing. You know, whether it's crying, what we might call uncontrollably, there's nothing wrong with that. And adults that can figure that out, and usually that means they're comfortable with their own sense of loss of control with their emotions. And so they can do the same for the kiddos that are going through this kind of stuff. Anything else? Any other negative effects on development you could think of? Yeah.
Social anxiety?
Yeah. Social impacts, which directly takes us down to this one in terms of relationships. But yes, social withdrawal would be part of that. Okay. What about strengths with development?
Can use the strengths of different stages in therapy. So like for kids playing and for adults being able to understand logically what happened.
Developmental strengths that go with it. I'll tell you, you need to get on your radar Erik Erikson's 8 stages of lifespan development. You need to get familiar with those. Because a kid that is at preschool age, and what's the critical life task at preschool age? It's autonomy versus shame and doubt. Well, what does a crisis remind each child of? That they're helpless. Okay? So we've got life tasks that come into play. If a kid is doing, kind of moving ahead, if you will, because development's uneven. It's not, you're in school, now you're that. Not at all. But having those on your radar helps you to sift through the data that you're looking at with each one. Louis Zamperini grew up in an interesting family. That it was a very Italian shame-based family, which has a direct impact then on how resilient he was going to be later. It was a high-achieving, high success rate or high success expectation kind of family, which led to all of his running and that he did. But at the same time, it was important. Anything else? Any other strengths that you could detect in development?
You can become a restart or a wake-up call.
Yeah. Wake up. Yeah, a redevelopment in a sense, kind of a refocusing on what needs to be done at the time. Anything else? Go ahead.
It can prepare you for future crises.
Absolutely, yeah. Preparation for future. The challenge is kind of framing it somehow. A lot of times people become resilient because they go through a crisis well during that developmental stage, which helps them become that much more resilient later. All right, the last one. What about ecosystem? This is environmental influences and things like that, yeah.
In theory, everything could be wrong.
everything could be gone. Is that what you said? Yeah. Yeah. You might call it systemic withdrawal. Social systems is what we're talking about here. A lot of times families go through a lot of trauma, crisis, and they just kind of pull in and they pull away from where all the social system support is. What else?
Could this be like I think it's called secondhand trauma, where like you get secondhand wounds from people in your life who are like denying it or denying help to you?
And we'll spend a little time talking about it in terms of secondary trauma. Secondary trauma. The systems are not helpful. A lot of times we love to point the gun at the church and some of the secondary kind of messages that are sent about victimhood, for example. Yeah.
I was connected to that, like cultural condemnation or silencing.
Yeah. Cultural messaging, for sure. Isolation. Silencing. Yep. Anything else that you think of? Negative impacts in social systems. What about strengths? We start out strong and we start running out of gas. What about strengths that you see?
Accountability.
Accountability. That can certainly be part of it. You know, another one is the strength of the family unit that you can put in there. If you're going to assess how somebody is going to respond, I need to know a lot about actually family development and how well put together this family is. Yeah.
Sometimes in crises, people can really like come together and there's like unity and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, the banding together against an adversary, and that can be any adversity. The willingness to do that, yes.
Provision for needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Provision and acceptance of needs. Needs. Okay. Anything else?
Redefining purpose.
Yeah, redefining purpose, and of that social unit goes into that as well. Okay, good. I see. Yeah, Cassie.
Like a strong support system.
Yeah, it's probably goes back to redefining, but a reestablishment of support system. Yeah, reestablishing that support system. Okay, good job. Well done. Take a break. See you back here at 3:15.